This one is something I've been looking forward to actually all day. It's about emerging markets, and we've already had quite a lot of talk about emerging markets today, including in our technology index. So we have a distinguished panel here today who are going to talk about that. Our moderator that I'm just going to introduce is Christy Coliseum. Christy is currently the Director of Technology Strategy and Transformation at a pan-European private equity business. He's a business consultant and has advised a number of companies over the years, such as BSkyB, BT, Cable & Wireless, Cisco, Siemens, to name but a few. His career started as a solution architect in the software industry in the US, as I understand it. He then joined the software unit of Arthur Andersen, and then ultimately going on to Deloitte's, and then leaving Deloitte's in 2009 to become a business consultant working with the London-based Radbourne Consulting Limited. So if I could ask you to welcome Christy and his colleagues on the panel, and they were talking about the emerging markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Let's start out learning a little bit about our panel. I'll start with my left, your right, Tim Watkins, who is the VP for Western Europe for sales and marketing for Huawei, the Chinese telecoms equipment manufacturer and technology company. Tim's been with Huawei since April 2009 and with Nortel before that. Tim's very active in this industry, in technology, and he's also a board member of Huawei in Europe. Tim, welcome. And next to Tim is Andrew Weiss. Andrew is the CTO of AirData, which is also a technology company that works very closely in the media space, particularly around security, and I'm sure Andrew will tell us a little bit more about his business as we go along. Andrew started out in the telecoms space and moved into the security space. Andrew currently holds a number of patents in the security technology space, has been involved in various startup activities at AirData, starting up new technology opportunities within that business, and he was involved, for example, with the launch of the world's first DVB conditional access system. Welcome, Andrew. Next to Andrew is Saul Singer, who's an author. Saul is the co-author with Dan Sinner of the best-selling book Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle. Before that, Saul was the editorial page editor and a columnist with the Jerusalem Post. Now, Saul's been doing very well in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal business bestseller list. Number 5, I think, is the latest. Congratulations. And currently, the book's being translated into various languages, which I'm sure we'll hear about, but Spanish, Italian, Japanese, Russian, Portuguese, etc. Welcome, Saul. And we also have Alistair Da Costa, who is the managing director for Asia Pacific for DLA Piper, essentially is in charge of emerging markets for DLA. And Alistair relocated to Hong Kong and has been in Hong Kong looking after countries like Australia, China, Japan, Singapore, and Thailand. And Alistair joined DLA Piper in 1992 and has been a board member of the global DLA Piper board since 2005. And prior to relocating to Asia from the UK, Alistair held a number of senior positions, including head of corporate, UK head of corporate group, EMEA, and head of financial services, EMEA. Welcome, Alistair. So in the lunch presentation of the index results and the survey results, we heard that technology opportunities for European companies are very high in the emerging markets. That's what the ranking said to us. Do you agree? And if so, why?
I would most certainly agree with that. In terms of our business, which is around content security, we've seen a massive uptake of digitization of television, for example, in China, India, and now in Eastern Europe. So most of our growth currently is in emerging markets. And I think what we have as a strength is that we do have proven deployments globally. And Europe is obviously has been historically for us a great launching pad for a lot of our technologies. And then that track record translates very well into emerging markets, or it has done so for us at least.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Huawei is, I'm sure a lot of the audience might not have heard of Huawei Technologies, but it's a $32 billion corporation based in China, privately owned, incidentally, owned by the employees, which was an interesting model. And certainly a lot of the innovation that's taken place in the Asian markets and developing markets in sort of rural China, Africa, have actually stimulated a huge amount of innovation that has great applicability in Western Europe and America. And this so-called reverse innovation trend is continuing and actually is being significantly leveraged by Huawei in many, many aspects. So, I mean, there are obviously rich pickings in the developing markets for sure, but the spin-off has been very surprising, that the innovation and the technology that comes out of those developing markets is almost surprisingly generated more revenue than the traditional R&D and innovation that was directed into the Western markets themselves.
So you must have some interesting perspectives when we put that in context with what's happening in Israel.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the striking things for me is I've been traveling a bit in the wake of the book and following the various languages of the book. And what's striking to me is something that we don't, I think, always appreciate in developed countries, which is that there are startups coming up in these countries, not just in China and India, places, or Korea, certainly, but in places even like Kenya, all kinds of places, and even the countries that we sometimes get excited about, like Brazil. We don't normally think of Brazil for startups. We think of Brazil as a big market, and so on. But this, I very much agree with this, with the comment about reverse innovation. I mean, the M-Pesa story in Kenya is a classic example of Kenya being ahead of Western countries, basically in a mobile payment system. And that we may actually see some innovations starting out in emerging markets and moving to the developing world. Not to mention the fact that, of course, most of the growth prospects are in the emerging markets. Even whether or not they're going to lead in technology, that's where the growth is going to be.
Alistair, as a European who's been immersed in emerging markets, what's your...
I mean, I think there's no doubt that emerging markets present huge opportunities for Western businesses. I mean, the demographics are right. There's a very young population in a lot of these countries. They are huge populations. It's not without its challenges, of course, and particularly in the technology space, the protection of certain rights is an issue. But when you look at, including Africa, which is an area for DLA Piper I'm responsible for, Europe has a real plus factor in terms of looking at some of these markets as a target area with the history of European involvement. So I think without doubt it's got to be a target market, particularly when growth rates in Europe are quite low at the moment. And the use of technology, one of the things I've experienced over the last 4 or 5 years, the use of technology is second nature to many people in these economies, because it's the way they want to get on as quickly as possible. And so it's not a nice to have, it's a must have, and it's a very natural thing for them to get involved with it.
Well, I was just going to add to that I think the whole thinking about going into emerging markets and this whole question of scaling outside emerging markets is really one that's, I think, taught Huawei a number of lessons. And that, a couple of examples are, for instance, in South Africa, we've been involved with a number of the carriers there to develop site innovation for base stations, for instance, so that we're developing very sophisticated self-powering base stations that will be powered by solar energy, wind energy, new technologies in batteries, So that not only is a dramatic saving in the efficiency of the base station, but of course it's self-sufficient. And solar panels wrapped around masts to provide even more improvement there. Now that's the sort of technology that actually can go on and be applicable in so many other markets, presumably the sunnier markets that we're talking about. And the M-Pesa example that you mentioned, I mean, this has really, I think, got the world thinking that here is an opportunity that emanated in Kenya that could be taken far further around the world, but at a completely different level of scaling to that which was originally envisaged because it's just swamped the Kenyan operator there. So that's an area where we're working to innovate outside of what happened in Africa into global markets, and we think that's going to be one of the huge transformations in the way mobile operators, fixed operators will operate in the future.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, what's your view on innovation involving some of these countries that you operate in?
I think it's had a tremendous impact on our development. We've actually do a lot of our development in Beijing, and some of the products we actually developed for the Chinese market actually had more success in European markets. Paradoxically, in this particular case, there was more conservatism in the Chinese market about certain technologies, and a greater willingness to experiment in the European case. So we developed this technology for the Chinese market, and in fact our first sales were actually in the European market. But I think having that different stimulation actually gets you thinking, it helps drive innovation and get you out the rut of thinking in a particular way. So that's been very, very powerful for us.
The other thing that seems to be going on is this leapfrogging phenomenon, where you have, again with Kenya, or we heard last night with Secretary Cohen said 19 million cell phones a month coming online in India. This kind of rate of adoption. And just when I was in Kenya and I was going along the highway and you see all these people walking, and I asked someone, why they're walking? They can't afford a bicycle, yeah, that's bicycles. They don't want to spend that kind of money. But do they have a cell phone? Of course they have a cell phone. They can't afford a bicycle, but they have a cell phone because exactly what you said. A bicycle is a luxury. A cell phone is a necessity, especially when you make mobile payments with it in a way that we can't in advanced Western countries. And so, to me, this is a tremendous opportunity. Is who's going to do startups for this market? Who's going to tackle some of the big problems that these markets have, and using their ability to their desire to willingness to leapfrog to technologies. In fact, the one thing interesting about M-Pesa is they tried it in South Africa, and it's not working so well. And one theory is that maybe because in Kenya, there are more people who don't have bank accounts, and you don't need a bank account to use M-Pesa. But in South Africa, you do have a bank account. So you have a check, you have a credit card, you have other options. So ironically, the lower level of development in Kenya made for the faster adoption of M-Pesa. And there are all kinds of things like that are going to happen in emerging markets.
Mm-hmm. Alistair, what are you saying with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think much the same. I think, I mean, a point that was made around some of the technologies coming out of the emerging markets that are adopted elsewhere. We've certainly seen, and I think in the renewable energy space as well, and the technology around that, there's no doubt places like China are leading and have the ability to actually show the West actually how it should be done. And I think that's kind of a role reversal, where you think most technology is actually coming out of the West and actually going to emerging markets. And I think the examples of the M-Pesa and renewables are examples where emerging markets are increasingly setting the trend and the pace. And I think this skip technology is a fascinating example of what is actually happening. And in Kenya, they have to do that. The distances are massive, the infrastructure is poor, and actually to get on and compete you need technology to do it. And so, you know, coming back, it's a must-have. It's not a luxury at all.
And optional.
But just to add the final point, I think the fact is that not everything is being done in China. I mean, one of the policies that Huawei has is that we're very keen to innovate and invest around the world in pockets of expertise. For instance, we're investing in Russia or Moscow, where there is a very significant algorithm skill set, mathematical skills very strong. So we're building a innovation center there. In Italy and Milan, we're investing there where there's a really, really good pool of expertise in microwave skills. So wherever there's a pocket of very, very relevant skills, the Chinese will invest, set up innovation centers, and that will fuel world demand from that region.
You also mentioned a design center in London.
Well, yes, that's hot off the press. There's a London design center actually for devices. Huawei's also into mobile devices. We'll be entering an own brand set of mobile phones and tablets. And the London Design Centre will be opening towards June of this year. And here we believe there's a huge expertise in the UK that we can draw on to really take us up to world-class design standards.
That's a convenient point for the next question, actually. Alistair, I'll start with you. In which areas do you think European businesses have key advantages when we're looking to get out to emerging markets?
Well, I think it kind of depends where you're looking, but I do think when you look at, particularly in Asian markets, they're very conscious about brand, very conscious about value as well. And I think the challenge for many Europeans looking to go in is to produce a product that has value, there's no doubt, and that means cost is an issue. But actually, there is an association with the brand of Europe that is very highly valued, and actually at the higher end often of technology spec is where I think Europeans can actually compete very, very well. I think that's one area. I think one other area is the sort of history of European involvement, and I do think, coming back to Africa, I think Europeans have a real edge in trying to compete there. But I think in terms of technology, my view would be it's quite often difficult to compete locally with organisations that are competing on price. But actually, if Europeans with their brand actually can compete on higher end technology, that's the area where I think they can have an edge.
Saul, any views?
On European, on what?
Yeah, where are the advantages for European companies? Now for example, you mentioned in your book that from day one, Israeli startups and technology companies had to go abroad to take their services out. And if European businesses are similarly trying to get out there, what should they take out?
Well, I think actually this issue of globalization and like you just said, that Israel kind of had an advantage and a disadvantage in that it was a tiny country and is somewhat isolated, that it forced us to be global. And the problem with being in a big country and a big market is you're kind of spoiled by that market. First you try to saturate that market, then you think about the regional market, then the global market. With Israel, we had no local market. We were shut off from the regional market. So we had to think globally from day one. So for Europe, I think, I just got back, I was at DLD in Munich, a big tech conference. And the feeling at tech conferences, even in Europe, is, I think, tends to be very America-centric, Silicon Valley-centric. It's kind of the Silicon Valley in the US is still the kind of funnel in which people think, and particularly in tech. And I think we have to change that in terms of getting out to emerging markets. The first thing is the change of mentality, is the idea that there's something to do in these markets, and that it's not just about the American market or another app for Facebook or something, that there really is a very important, dynamic, growing market in these areas that we have to begin to address. And it kind of starts with that mental shift.
Andrew?
I think in the digital television business in which we're very active, one of the advantages of being European has been that Europe has been very successful in fostering open ecosystems. So where we had an edge against our American competition was that the American market developed these very proprietary silos of technology, and the European model was much more standardized. And anybody from the outside looking in sort of saw key advantages that going with European technology was actually had much lower cost of ownership because it was open and allowed a lot more competition into it. So I think that's one area I think where Europe has had a strength in enabling these open ecosystems. It's a good question whether it's going to be able to maintain that going forward, given the way globalization is going. But historically, it certainly has been very beneficial.
Changing the topic a little bit, political landscape, how important is it? So we're considering phenomenon like the Arab Spring. Is stability a requirement? What's the implication?
I think there's a kind of one of the things which I think will come out of the Arab Spring if it's fully successful is I think the closed political systems actually stifle economic innovation. And you may say, okay, stability is great because it's stable and enables things to grow. But you find where you have strong political control, it's actually extending into economic interests as well. And that really makes operating those markets really difficult. So I'm firmly of the opinion that greater political openness, okay, there will be short-term instability. The long-term benefits of that will be significant.
Yeah, I think politically the most forward-thinking governments of Europe have embraced a lot of the Chinese investment and has actually done extremely well. And that's contrasted probably with the Americans who are definitely in the other camp and looking to protect their markets rather than embrace it. I mean, last year Huawei invested something in the order of $6.9 billion in goods and services bought from America. And that's in spite of the Chinese the sort of barriers to entry, as it were. So there's a huge amount of work that the governments can do to embrace Asian or foreign investment. And I was very surprised to see that statistic earlier on about, I think it was 12% of the respondents believed that there was a market in China compared with the rest of the world. And I think there's a huge amount more that the government can be doing to work with Chinese companies that are looking to inward invest into Europe and develop reciprocity and help them get into China and use companies like Huawei who know their way around the way things work in China and are perfectly willing to give help and assistance in the way that we did recently. We hosted 120 UK businesses in China, in Shanghai, on a recent tour with UKTI. That's the kind of initiative not just UK, but European governments can exploit much more to the full, I think, than we have done to date.
I think that by and large, the rule of thumb is that innovation sectors thrive in an open political environment. That said, I think that if you look at the very different political environments in say China, India, Brazil, Africa, that in all of them there are opportunities, and in all of them there are advantages and disadvantages of the situation, and there isn't any kind of ironclad obstacle to either building an innovation sector or working with these markets in terms of technology. But at the end of the day, the innovation sector is a bottom-up phenomenon. I mean, there's some things that governments can do, and some things that governments can actually help by not doing, and so forth. But the governments are, at the end of the day, either enablers or obstacles. But the fundamental energy of it is always bottom-up, and so that, in the long term, that points to open political systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, technology is energetic by its nature, its development. I think it operates better in open systems. And actually, you could argue that technology can open up closed systems as well. And I think you've seen that around the world. That said, I mean, it is a challenge for organisations used to open systems going into systems that they're not quite sure about. And you know, for 1 year it could be reasonably open, and then next year it can change very quickly. And you know, that is a challenge when you're long-term planning. And what's long-term today? Maybe 2 or 3 years, but can be a challenge. Twitter has now just found that actually there are certain parts of emerging markets now that are shutting down and censoring what is said on their accounts. Now, that is going to create a different model for that organisation, how it goes into emerging markets. And so you've got to be ready for the challenge of so open, but then it can close a little bit. But ultimately, my view is, I think it is a trend that is going to lead to more openness.
Yeah, and it's the irony is that you know, there's this kind of debate between India and China, where the Indians are often looking to China with envy, where they have an open but also chaotic system compared to China, which sometimes hinders them. You know, so it's a complicated thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. There was a discussion earlier in some of the panels about culture, and so you mentioned innovation is a bottom-up phenomenon. What role does culture play?
Well, culture is a huge thing. I mean, the Startup Nation is in the business section of the bookstore. It's a business book, but what's strange about it as a business book is it ends up mostly about culture and history, because we basically try to answer the question, why have all these startups popped up in Israel of all places, and the answer tends to be a cultural one in terms of what makes, to summarize the whole thing very quickly, is that what gives Israelis kind of more drive and willingness to take risks than in other places, because those things are the key ingredients, in addition to creative ideas, to turn ideas into startups and to innovations. You need that drive and you need that willingness to take risks. And that's a cultural issue, and that's a huge thing that countries struggle with, is trying to overcome parts of their culture that are against that. But I actually think that can be done, because what you can do is create enclaves. Silicon Valley is an enclave within the United States. Not everything is like Silicon Valley. It's an enclave where you have that culture. Israel itself the whole country is that kind of enclave. But in other countries, you can create enclaves that are cultural safe zones for being entrepreneurs and taking risks and doing startups.
Yeah, I think those border issues between India and China have largely been resolved from a point of view of trade. And so business is flowing between China and India reasonably well right now. So I think that's a particular fire that's been put out, and we're quite happy with that situation. But culture, I mean, I think my experience of working in a Chinese company over the last 3 years is cultural alignment and understanding is absolutely everything. Huawei is celebrating its 10th year in Europe, and I would say it's taken us 10 years to really get to the point where the value that Huawei brings to the operators and the service providers of Europe isn't just price. I'm sure it's competitive, but the landscape is pretty much aligned price-wise. It's now about the cultural alignment, the enthusiasm, the energy, the belief, the responsiveness that the Chinese people bring is something that the Western suppliers are now having to replicate. Probably something they had 20, 25 years ago. But customers are inspired by this sheer enthusiasm to delight customers. And that's changed the landscape. And in so many ways, I think the cultural differences have really brought very much more than just low prices. It's brought a whole new way of thinking about pursuing business. And that's been very refreshing for me. For a bit of an old lag who's been in the industry a long time, I've kind of gone almost back 25, 30 years to my roots and relearned a lot of tricks I learned 30 years ago.
I think our exposure in emerging markets, what that has done is, in a sense, helped stimulate a startup culture within our company itself, because you're always having to go into these completely new markets where things are starting from fresh, and there are fresh perspectives on how to solve certain problems or how to deliver certain types of services. So that's been a very powerful way of keeping the company itself dynamic. And then also through our expansion and actually putting development into, particularly into Beijing. Again, that's also been hugely stimulative throughout the company in terms of here's a new market, but also new ways of doing business, and having to sort of adapt to that it has kept the organisation much more fresh than I think they could have been.
What you mean through going into China?
Yes, working very closely with companies like China Mobile and Huawei, and then also engaging the cable industry within the Chinese
so it's pulled the business along,
yes,
as well as providing a new market for it.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what is said there. I mean, I think for culture also see flexibility as well, and I think we've seen a lot of clients move into emerging markets, and if you don't have the ability to have a degree of flexibility, you are going to struggle. And I think that flexibility in terms of your management style, how you engage people in the markets you're in to get involved in your leadership as well, and I think that's very, very important. There is a real energy and a dynamism that I think a lot of Western businesses can tap into, but it also comes down to basics as to knowing how to change your product a little bit so that it's attractive in your market. Tesco can't sell what it sells in Europe in China. It has to change what's on its shelves, and I think that's the same. So have a degree of flexibility around how you approach the market, how you engage with people, and how you actually manage them. And I think you can actually tap into some real talent.
Yeah, I would just, on this culture thing, I would just add that when we think about cultural differences, we often think of them as kind of obstacles, as a problem, as a difficulty. But cultural differences often are a huge source of innovation and creativity and synergy. And in fact, when you think about Europe and emerging markets, European culture has certain strengths. Emerging markets have certain strengths vis-a-vis each other. And I think about what Israel has done with American and with other companies, where there are cultural differences, that these cultural differences have been a part of what have made the combination so powerful, is exactly combining the strengths of different cultures. And in fact, when people ask, what can we learn from Israel or whatever, what I say is that every country has its own path to innovation. The United States had a very different path than Israel, had none of the sources of adversity that Israel went through. For us, adversity has been a kind of a crucible for innovation. But the US has a completely different background and yet produced Silicon Valley. So it shows that every country has its own culture and history and has to build on that to find its own path. And then combining those paths, it can be very powerful.
Tim, you mentioned some of the lessons that you learned and that you're applying now again in some of the things that you do. Maybe we can talk about a few lessons.
Well, I think one of them is really following on from what Saul was just saying, that going into another country and learning about its culture prior to entry is far more than reading a book on it. No disrespect to your book, Saul, but and that's probably the extent to the many potential businessmen who want to go into China or Asian countries get to. I mean, it's very clear to me that Chinese companies, not just Huawei, invest huge amounts of money in hiring consultants or advisory boards or members who really do understand the local landscape, not just the cultural aspects, but the political aspects, the understanding all the barriers to entry before they set foot in that country. And once they do, they then build it up. And that's something I think I've seen exploited to a far greater extent than I ever believed that it was necessary. But it pays dividends. So preparation in advance of entry, either into major opportunities or countries, has been one of the real lessons of preparation, I think. That's one simple example. But I mean, the other one is just sheer, enthusiasm and understanding that when you're doing business in China or a Chineseman says yes, he doesn't necessarily mean yes. And that takes a bit of getting used to, that there are many different yeses. Yeah. There's yes, I understand, as opposed to yes, I agree. And that took a while to really understand that one.
Yeah, I think the lesson we've learned from being in emerging markets is that it's not a quick thing. You have to actually have feet on the ground, spend a lot of time, and put people into the markets and build up people with local market knowledge. it's not something you can just go in and out and expect to have success. It's really something you build up over a long period of time. You've got to think years and not months or weeks for sure.
Saul, from your perspective?
Well, yes. I mean, what you were just saying about that, it reminds me of, people think of the United States and Israel as kind of almost cultural twins, but it's Intel, when they came to Israel, they actually had to, they decided to do cross-cultural seminars to try to bridge the gaps between the Israeli and the American employees. And a lot of it had to do with exactly what you were saying in terms of trying to understand. Well, Israelis would tend to be kind of brash and maybe taken as rude. They have a penchant for debate and for saying what they think. There's a great story in the book where the Americans in Intel Israel, and they see a bunch of people in the conference room, and they're yelling and screaming at each other, and they come out all red-faced, and he's kind of worried. He said, what happened? What happened? And they come out and say, well, nothing. We had a great discussion. It's like that's, and so you have to kind of learn how to interpret these cultural differences.
Yeah, I agree with that first-hand experience of yes, I understand, or yes, I agree. It takes a bit of time to build up that understanding. But I think relationships and putting in the time to build relationships is very, everyone talks about building relationships in business, but it's very much part of Asian culture in particular. And they will take their time. And I think but preparation and the building of relationships before people make strategic decisions, we've just got to get used to, because that's how many of these economies work, how these cultures work. And it's not such a bad thing, actually. Western culture is very much get on with it, make a decision, do it quickly, and that has advantages as well. But actually the preparation, the building of relationships, the thorough understanding of what you're getting into, I think we need to understand that, because it is the way business is done, it's the way things are done.
Well, I mean, I think the key element of relationship is trust. And there's a lot of talk about, do we really trust the Chinese coming into Western Europe and to UK specifically? Are they trustworthy to have Chinese technology within networks? But thinking about it the other way, I mean, there's a huge amount of trust required bilaterally. The Chinese have got to build relationships. You've got to develop a level of trust with them as well. And I think that's often forgotten, that actually you almost think you can take it for granted. We're British, we're European, you can trust us without question. And of course, that's not the case at all.
Yes.
It's a two-way street. Great. Well, we should open up to the audience. Any questions in the audience? We've got about 10 minutes, so we can take a few questions. Yeah, while the audience thinks about things, I'll pose another question.
There's one over there.
Oh, there's one.
I'm Bertolt Berbus here from DLA Piper in Brussels. My question is a very general one, and it is more a political question. Emerging markets sometimes means, countries with difficult, let's say, political situations. In your view and experience, has there ever been a situation where you have been, let's say, in a delicate position and where you had to maneuver a lot in order to kind of, behave ethically and save your reputation and that sort of thing?
We have had experience where we just, where you kind of start to engage a particular opportunity and it just suddenly becomes very complicated, and you can see there's lots of politics and it's getting into sort of very grey areas. And we actually just walked away from that because we felt it was just going to become too complex, and it was a situation where I think we just felt the risks were getting too high and the rewards just weren't going to be there, and so we just backed off from that. So I think you actually do confront that often. I feel it's perhaps getting less than it has been in the past. I do feel there's a lot more progress being made in terms of openness of doing business.
Yeah, I think from the Chinese point of view, there's my experience is certainly that Huawei has built such a global reputation now that the slightest betrayal of trust through some inappropriate dealings would have such a devastating effect on the business globally. It would give competitors and industry commentators such a lot of ammunition to destroy us with that we are extremely careful about the way we operate. Every one of our 140,000 employees regularly signs declarations that, they're going to abide by the rules and regulations of the business and not take any risks. And I think it's absolutely crucial. I think long gone are the days, certainly in China, where the perception that technology is copied, reverse innovated, and patents are not respected. Huawei itself is the owner of some 50,000 patents. It's registering patents at the rate of about 15,000 patents a year right now. So it's not only demands respect, it offers respect and pays billions in IPR royalties. So actually China, the Chinese organizations are seeking to take the high ground here. And I think the recent legislation in Europe about bribery and corruptions and Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts have been religiously rolled out, certainly in our organization. I know many other Chinese organizations. So I think things are changing for sure.
Any other questions in the audience?
Over here, this one.
This one,
Hello, Gökhan Gökçe from DLA Piper, Turkey. Actually, when I listened to you, you talked about brand value and the trust and also the perception. When you say emerging markets, are there differences in your company's strategies when analyzing these countries? Because, in terms of certain parameters like geographical location, population, the existence of providers, etc., I'm sure there are lots of significant changes in analyzing those markets. And do you face or observe mistakes or over-investments in some of those countries?
Is that for me? Well, yes, certainly. I think if one goes back 15 years, Huawei moved out of China. It was a domestic supplier. Started off in the rural areas, moved into the urban areas, and then, of course, moved into Asia, then into Africa, then into Eastern Europe, and then into Western Europe. We're still doing some penetration testing in the USA as well. But clearly, as we moved west, many of the markets that were particularly attractive to us, in terms of strategic nature, have become less strategic because they're already established. So in many ways, I think we're thinking very much like any Western organization or a global organization would think. We're looking at global markets, we're looking at traditional barriers to entry, and conventional assessments. Turkey is a particularly good example because actually Turkey is a very big market for Huawei, and we do very well there.
Well, I think we've got time for maybe one question to the panel. I'll ask one final question. If you had to pick one trend, a technology trend that European businesses can take advantage of, what would that be over the next few years?
I'd actually, rather than a technology-related point, which my fellow panelists can refer to, I'd just say Africa, actually. I think there's going to be huge opportunity for Africa, the use of technology in its various forms, particularly mobile. So I would say Africa over the next 10 years will be a significant opportunity.
It's actually funny just to say that because that is something we have a strong linkage to South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And that has actually been a major area for growth for some of our products, particularly in satellite television. That was one of the largest growing markets for us in the last couple of years. So it has actually been hugely successful for us. So yeah, I'd actually agree with that. I think Africa's got a lot of surprises and it's probably the potential to be the next India or the next China. Lots of challenges, but a lot of potential, I think.
Yeah, I think I'd probably go along with the Google strategy of the world, where I was at a conference recently and they were explaining that their strategy had been orientated around so, low, co. I'm sure many of you have heard this so, social, low, local commercialize. But they've put on the front of that a Mo, which is Mo Solo Co. And I absolutely agree with them, because the Mo is mobile. And everything that we do, whether it be IPTV, whether it be Facebook-type service, social networking, and monetizing all of those areas is going to be orientated around mobility and how those aspects are mobilized. And that's very much at the heart of what Huawei is doing, both in its cloud computing and its enterprise new ventures, and also partly why Huawei is putting so much emphasis on becoming a global number 3 player in handsets, tablets, and mobile devices. So that's our game, should we say.
Trent?
Yeah, I would just say that that these two things are happening at once in emerging markets. And on one hand, you have this, certainly in Africa, this huge backlog of infrastructure that needs to be built, basic electrification, water, everything. Roads, trains, basic things. But at the same time, all that has to be built. You have this mobile revolution with everybody getting cell phones. And actually what's in some ways most interesting is the combination of the two, is where you have these leapfrogging, for instance, who's going to put in fixed phone lines when everybody's going to mobile? So you can maybe skip a whole layer of infrastructure, but it's this intersection between the new economy and the new technologies and the old stuff that still needs to be built. Together, I think creates great opportunities for Western countries, and also great challenges in terms of innovative ways to combine the two and see how things are going to be different for them and their progression compared to what it was for developed countries.
Very good. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I think we can talk about this for a whole day. Maybe the next conference could be just on emerging markets, Simon.
Christy, can I just thank you and the panel for what I think everyone will agree was just an incredibly interesting session. Thank you really for all the time and effort you put in. So maybe you would just join me in thanking them.